It's almost 5 years since my darling Rosemary went to her eternal reward and to her eternal dwelling. The reason for a memorial lecture and talk is to keep her memory alive amongst her family and friends and all those that loved her and all those that she so greatly loved as well. And thank you for being with us for that reason tonight. David Quinn and his wife Rachel have been great friends of Rosemary and mine for many, many years. I was honoured when David set up the Iona Institute when he invited me to be a patron. I was one of the original patrons with Father Vincent Toomey and Professor Patricia Casey, and I've had a very long association with David. Rosemary always considered David was her moral compass. Whenever she wished to have clarity on any affairs, she didn't ask what did the Pope say or what did the Archbishop say or even the bishops, but she always said, what did David say on that topic? And she always referred to David's view, and it was always very sound. David needs no introduction because he's so greatly admired by us all for the stand he's taken on the family and on so many moral issues over the years. And I think we owe him a great debt of gratitude for all he's done for us. Rosemary was passionate about the Catholic ethos of the 3 hospitals that we were involved, that we founded, and she considered it our greatest legacy apart from our 4 great children. And I'm delighted that 3 of my children are with us here tonight, Kathy, Michael and Mark. Thank you for being with us. There's no one more appropriate than David to give this memorial lecture in Rosemary's honour. And David, it's a great privilege to introduce you.
So thank you, Jimmy. It's a great honour and pleasure to give this talk this evening. When Jimmy asked me last year, I was wondering what the topic should be. And I thought really that in memory of Rosemary and indeed of the work that Jimmy did in his life along with Rosemary, that a defence of Catholic healthcare was very appropriate. Last year when he asked me, this is around the time there was a huge row taking place over the relocation of the National Maternity Hospital from its present site in Holles Street to the St. Vincent's campus. Huge demonstrations against it. Well, not huge, noisy demonstrations against it outside Leinster House. Plenty of political opposition, plenty of media opposition. And in fact, you may have seen reported in the Irish Catholic last week that St. Vincent's Public Hospital has removed all the religious pictures and statues and symbols, and I think even the pictures of the nuns who founded it, from its premises. So that's a real sign of where things are going, and that's one of the things I'll be commenting on in this talk. So as I say, the topic was prompted partly by the row over the National Maternity Hospital, which I can deal with as we go along here. The attack was the occasion of the most massive attack on the nuns, and particularly obviously the Religious Sisters of Charity who founded that hospital. It was also the occasion of a huge attack on Catholic healthcare. That Catholic ethos was presented as opposed to modern medicine and women's health especially. So the country was far better off without it, which is a thesis I will argue very strongly against in this talk. So an outline of the talk. So the background atmosphere to all this. So I'll come to that. The origin and motivations of Catholic healthcare. So I'm going to go right back to the beginning of Christianity. The contrast with what I will call pro-choice medicine, and the sheer contrast between Christian healthcare, because we can use that term more broadly, and pro-choice medicine could not be starker in ways I'll outline in this talk. The issues and challenges facing Catholic and Christian, and indeed pro-life healthcare, and as I'll explain, by the way, Hippocratic medicine as well, and also rising to the challenge of all this. So the background atmosphere, rational debate about Catholicism in this country is almost impossible. Because every time you try to say anything good about the Catholic Church, the scandals are raised. So I think one of the things actually we need to be able to do in this country, and be more willing to do it, is to call out and recognize anti-Catholicism when we see it, because there is an awful lot of it about. Now, let me ask this question. How do we know, it may seem like a strange question, but hopefully it'll make sense in a moment. How do we recognize that Nigel Farage is anti-EU? Well, the reason we recognize that is because he's always criticizing the EU. Because he only points out what he thinks are the bad things it does. Now, this is no commentary on the European Union. It's just how do you recognize when somebody is anti-EU? He never credits it with anything, and he wishes for the demise of the EU quite clearly, and campaigned, obviously, to get Britain out of the European Union. Well, very similar attitudes exist and are widespread towards Catholicism. So the worst interpretation is regularly put on everything the Church does and on its teaching. So this is a very, very widespread, the worst interpretation all the time. There is a relentless focus on its failings. Now, God knows the Church is 2,000 years old. It is a vast organization worldwide that has had over time billions of members with all the failings that human nature has. And they have all been exposed completely within the Christian Catholic community over those 2,000 years. And there have been many scandals that have beset the Church over that time. So we have plenty to look back on with a large degree of shame. But is this the entire picture? And the answer is obviously it is not. Because if you take any old organization, a large organization, or an old society, or an old civilization, you will find many failings. And would it be fair, for example, to reduce British history solely to the failings and crimes and sins of the British Empire? And the answer would be no. And would it be fair to solely focus on the crimes of the British Empire, including many in this country, and not talk about how Britain founded parliamentary democracy and spread parliamentary democracy to other countries like India, Ireland, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand? It would obviously be unfair to leave that out of the picture, or to talk about how Britain finally decided we're going to abolish the slave trade and absolutely put us all into doing it and succeeded. It would not be fair. You would say such a person is anti-British. So the achievements of the Church, rarely highlighted. Any one of you in this room, or in the next room, the overflow room, could very quickly make the case for the prosecution against the Catholic Church. But if you were put to the pin of your collar and you were asked, now make the case for the defence, talk about its achievements, even an audience like this might be a bit more hard-pressed, because we're so accustomed to reading about the failings. All right? A number of years ago, the Iona Institute commissioned an opinion poll, and we asked a number of questions about people's attitudes towards the Church. And fully a quarter of those polled, this is about 10 years ago, said they would like if the Catholic Church vanished completely from Irish society. Now, that is not anti-Catholicism. Nothing is. All right? So there is a lot of it about, and we need to call it as such. All of this makes it incredibly difficult to have a reasonable discussion about anything related to the Church, including the contribution to healthcare. Now, this is one of the more harmless posters that appeared outside Leinster House last year in protest against the relocation of the National Maternity Hospital to St. Vincent's campus. So, I don't know if you can see it, but we have a nun, and her face is blanked out and replaced with something red. On it, lies, nuns out, somebody wearing the repeal sweatshirt beside it, and then beside that, make abortion available in the new maternity hospitals. That's one of the milder posters that was on display. I mean, there has been so many images of nuns wholly and completely demonizing. It has been simply stunning. And the nuns have been reduced basically to the likes of the Kew Mother and Baby Home. That's a story for another day. I mean, the Mother and Baby Home report came out, and it was much more nuanced and complicated than it had been presented in the media, by the way. And it got attacked for that reason. And it's been kind of dropped down a memory hole. And it was much more complex about Hume, by the way. I mean, you ought to read it and what it says about Hume. Much more complex than we're seeing reported. And of course, they've been reduced to the Magdalene laundries as well. Martin McAleese produced a report about 10 years ago, maybe less, about the Magdalen laundries. Again, much more complex than the common picture. The only movies you tend to see about nuns nowadays is the Magdalen Sisters, which seems to be endlessly on repeat, and by the way, does not match the Martin McAleese report, and then movies like Philomena's Story, which is to do with the mother and baby homes. So the Religious Sisters of Charity became the particular focal point of the attack because the National Maternity Hospital was being moved to St. Vincent's campus, and they, at that point, were in charge of St. Vincent's, public, private, and St. Michael's, so I think that's in Dunleary. And all we heard was the case against, so again, Magdalen laundries and what have you. But these nuns, that's not quite true. The nuns were founded some years before. This is the Religious Sisters of Charity. But one of their first big jobs was in the middle of a cholera epidemic that broke out in Dublin in the 1830s. And that, by the way, gave rise to the first public water system in Dublin and much better sanitary conditions. There's a statue of that man, I think his name is Gray, which is on O'Connell Street. He saved more lives, by the way, than any doctor. No insult, Julie. Clean water saves a lot of lives. And if you can get clean water to houses, you save a lot of lives. So that was one of the lessons from the cholera epidemic. But these nuns, these women, they went out into the cholera epidemic. There's no vaccinations then. There's no antibiotics then. Dublin has many slums. The conditions are appalling, like they were in practically all cities at the time. And they basically risked their lives going out into this cholera epidemic. And that wasn't the first one, or the last one that nuns and others have gone out into. So I sometimes wondered when I was looking at some of the people attacking the nuns over the maternity hospital and other things, how many of those critics were alive because a nun had nursed one of their ancestors back to health? And I reckon there's a few, right? The Sisters of Charity founded the first hospital for women in Ireland, and that was St. Vincent's, and I think it was originally on St. Stephen's Green, and was founded in around 1834. So that was the first hospital founded for women in Ireland. And then they founded Our Lady's Hospice, which was the first hospice in Ireland. These are tremendous achievements. And this is without going into Nan O'Nagel and the Presentation Sisters. So she was from a well-to-do family. I think essentially whatever was left of Catholic gentry at the time in Cork. And this is the end of the 18th century. And she gives up her life of comfort and she starts to educate the poor of Cork. Now again, the poor then were quite different from what you get now because they were in the most revolting slum conditions. So if you watch Dickens' adaptations, you have some idea, but even that's sanitized compared to what it would have been like. And then you've got Catherine Macaulay and the Sisters of Mercy, founded at a similar time. This is all around the time the penal laws are beginning to lift. Then of course Mary Aikenhead founded the Religious Sisters of Charity. By the way, Florence Nightingale, who's credited with founding modern nursing, she gave huge credit to the Sisters of Mercy, and a particular nun whose name currently escapes me, but she said basically she taught me about nursing. So what Florence Nightingale did was she took the lessons from the nuns already working in healthcare, and then she applied the lessons to lay people, to lay women who took up the nursing vocation, but it originated with nuns, okay, who we are just so content to demonize all the time. And the Religious Sisters of Charity are still behind many charitable endeavours to this day. I remember Kieran Mulvey, who I think was head of the, what's it called, the Labour Mediation Council or something. Correct. So he, I think, was partly behind the deal that led to the relocation of the National Maternity Hospital eventually to St. Vincent's campus. And he was appalled by the attacks on the nuns. Now, as far as I know, Kieran Mulvey would be probably a Labour supporter. I can't be sure of that. But he wouldn't be, your Catholic apologist like I'd be accused of being. But he was appalled by the attacks, and he was pointing out all the good things that the Religious Sisters of Charity still do. So here's an irony. Nuns are the last group of women it is acceptable to attack. you would be accused of sexism for attacking any other group of women, but you can attack them with complete impunity, and they do not even seem to be considered real women, and are even presented as somehow the enemies of the female sex. Now, where's my glass? Question. Where in the world, and I mean historically, not just today, outside of the Catholic Church, can we find organizations run solely by women that founded gigantic international networks dedicated to healthcare and education? And if you sit down and think about that for a moment, you won't be able to come up with anything, because there isn't anything. So these religious orders of nuns, sisters, were the first all-female organizations in the world to found these gigantic multinational networks that still exist to this day, and again receive no credit, or little credit. So these nuns were actually proving to the world, before feminism was invented, that if you leave women to themselves, they can found anything. So the idea that women should be consigned to the domestic sphere, they already proved, well, actually, if you don't consign us to the domestic sphere, look at what we can do. Right? So you go anywhere else in the world, you think about any other period in history, you are not going to find anything equivalent. Nothing. All right? So feminists should be absolutely delighted with them. And there are actually some more fair-minded ones, you see the odd article turn up, who do actually recognize and acknowledge this. But it is incredibly rare for it to be properly acknowledged. But there it is right in front of us. So hang on. So the origins of Christian healthcare. So that's a depiction of Jesus healing the blind man. And obviously in the Gospels, there's many examples of his healing ministry. So obviously, early Christians wanted to emulate this because it is so prominent in his ministry. And if you take the passage from Matthew 25, now this is so commonplace now that we don't see the astonishing and groundbreaking nature of it. So Jesus says, "For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." So Jesus obviously was from a Jewish milieu. So that kind of thinking would have been quite common in the Jewish world. But it was unknown in the pagan world. All right? It was unknown in ancient Greece. It was unknown in ancient world. It was unknown among the Germanic tribes and the tribes of Gaul and so on. Nothing like this existed outside the Jewish world. But now, something like that from Jesus has been repeated so often that it has lost its novelty and we take it for granted. But that forms the whole basis for the Christian theory of charity. Nothing in the pagan world said that healthcare should be available to all. Nothing. There's an excellent book about all this, by the way, for those who like these things. It's called Medicine and Healthcare in Early Christianity by an American academic called Gary Ferngren, Ferngren. It's superb, quite heavy going in places, but also extremely enlightening about the origins of Christian healthcare. And he points out, and he's not the only one to point out, that the idea that healthcare should be available to all was a complete novelty in the pagan world. Doctors at that time did exist, but they served almost entirely the rich. And the idea that they would set up hospitals or go into the slums of Rome, and we again a very sanitized view of Rome from watching movies like Gladiator, right? I mean, the slums, appalling, the filth, appalling, diseases and plagues would break out regularly, all right? So these doctors were available to the rich, they were not available to the poor. And this was deemed completely natural. Nobody thought to question that doctors should be only available to the rich. The pagans, this is now this book I mentioned, he says they did believe in dignity, human dignity, but only for the virtuous person, as they would define the virtuous person. They didn't believe that the person down in the gutter was a virtuous person. They did not believe in the intrinsic dignity of everyone. So why did Christians wish to care for everyone, regardless of status or money? So the reason is that we believe everyone is made in the image and likeness of God. Now again, this is something that we completely take for granted. But nobody believed that everyone was made in the image and likeness of Zeus or Apollo or any of these Roman or Greek gods. And from this came the belief that everyone is morally equal, an unheard of belief. All right, again, one we take for granted. It is the entire basis, by the way, of kind of liberal belief that we're all created, not created, because a lot of them do not believe in God, so don't believe we're made in the image and likeness of God, but they do believe that we're all morally equal. They think that's something you can just kind of lift out of nowhere, but actually it's ultimately a Judeo-Christian belief that comes from there, all right? And if this belief we're all made in the image and likeness of God goes, it is not guaranteed that the belief we're all morally equal is going to persist 100, 200 years' time if we completely cut ourselves off from our Christian roots. Christians, by the way, right in the early days, and this is partly credited to the rise of Christianity in the Roman world, when a plague would break out, and like the plague of Cyprian, which I think was the 2nd or 3rd century, kills enormous numbers of people. One of the great doctors of the time, his name was Galen, and his writings remain to this day. So what did he do when the plague broke out? He fled Rome to his house in Asia Minor to sit it all out. Many Christians remained. They remained behind to look after their own, and they remained behind to look after non-Christians too. And many of them died as a consequence of this. But on the other hand, many lived who would not otherwise have lived from getting basic care, like being kept hydrated and being kept fed. Basic care. Because this is all they could offer, was very rudimentary care, but it kept many alive who would otherwise have died. And this impressed the non-Christians of the time and helped to lead to conversions to Christianity. When Constantine, in the middle of the 4th century, lifts the restrictions on Christianity, so what happens? Christians immediately begin founding hospitals. Now, before Constantine, Christians couldn't do that. There were a handful of hospitals, but they existed to repair soldiers and put them back into battle, and to repair slaves and put them back to work. Nobody else had access to hospitals. If you were rich, you had a doctor come to your house. So when Constantine lifts the restrictions, they immediately begin founding hospitals. So the first hospital aimed at ordinary people was founded in Byzantium or Constantinople. Istanbul as it's known now, very soon after the restrictions on Christianity are lifted. And the first hospital in Rome was founded in about 390 by a Roman noblewoman called Fabiola, who's mentioned by St. Jerome. And she, according to St. Jerome, spent the whole, I think she had 2 disastrous marriages. So she decides then to dedicate her life to looking after the sick. And back then, the sores, the wounds, the leprosy, again, the sheer filth of the conditions at the time. So, I mean, you go into a hospital then, it's not like now, all right? It's very different and a far more challenging environment. And that's what she was doing. She was kind of a prototype for the later work of the female religious congregations. Most monasteries had an infirmary attached, all right? And then, as Europe begins to get back on its feet after the fall of the Roman Empire and the barbarian invasions, is around the Middle Ages, a lot of hospitals that get founded in the major cities of that time. By the way, the Rotunda is the first hospital in the world that was a maternity training hospital, and that was in 1745. So Christians borrowed from Hippocratic medicine because it was so compatible. So there are debates, so we all know about the Hippocratic Oath. And there are apparently debates about the exact origin and wording of that. But there's no dispute about the fact that the underlying philosophy of the Hippocratic Oath or Hippocratic medicine was first do no harm. All right, so Hippocratic medicine was against abortion, and it was against euthanasia, and obviously would have been against the exposure of infants, which was quite a common practice in Roman times. And Christians, of course, were also against abortion and euthanasia and the exposure of infants. So there was a complete compatibility between Christianity and Hippocratic medicine. But Hippocratic medicine was not an offer to everyone. See, that's the difference. So Christianity kind of took it, and of course took the healing ministry of Jesus and applied it to everyone it could. Now this is in conditions, by the way, where there simply weren't enough people to offer healthcare to everyone. It's still a challenge today, with all our wealth, to offer healthcare to everyone. There's still only a handful who got it, but they were doing their best to do it. Now a question, I've been in debates about this, would something like Christian healthcare, that is something like Hippocratic medicine, first do no harm medicine, have been made available to everyone? So that's another philosophy that doesn't come from nowhere. Would that have arisen without Christianity? So there's kind of an assumption. If you rip Christianity completely out of Western history and Irish history, we'd have ended up with the same philosophy anyway. And I think that is highly contestable. Because when Christian missionaries first arrived in other parts of the world outside Europe and the Middle East, parts of Asia, there were few, if any, hospitals. This was including in very ancient civilizations like China. The nearest thing they had in hospitals in China would have been infirmaries attached to Buddhist monasteries. And various Chinese emperors did their best to suppress Buddhism anyway. So you would have had traditional medicine, traditional healers would have been common in villages and towns in China, like elsewhere in the world, because traditional medicine is still very widespread in the world, using herbs and potions and so on. But Wuhan, which was much in the news this time 3 years ago, for reasons we all know, I was interested to read that city is hundreds of years old. The first hospital was only founded in the 1880s by a Franciscan missionary from Italy. All right, so if hospitals are something that every civilization arrives at when it reaches a certain stage of development, then why is it that when Christians arrive in various parts of the world there are no hospitals? All right, because essentially we largely invented them. All right, so I'm up against somebody like Peter Boylan. He would completely take for granted that of course we're going to get the hospitals. That ain't necessarily so by any means. I mean, this may seem like a slightly ridiculous comparison, but the Spanish arrived crashing on top of the Aztecs and the Incas in the 1500s. So they've been around a long time, okay? Because human history is around a long time by the 1500s. Are there any hospitals? There are not. So we cannot take their existence for granted. So I say the idea that everyone deserves healthcare needs a basis. It does not come from nowhere. And if you ripped Christianity out of Western history, I'm not convinced you would necessarily have got to hospitals, because otherwise you would find them everywhere that civilizations have developed to a certain point, and you don't. So when we take all that for granted, you see, it's easy to dismiss the Christian contribution. It's based on ignorance. And we're often too ignorant ourselves about it. So Christians are committed to healing and caring. Now what that means is healing a person where possible, and where they can't be healed, caring for them. All right? Hang on a second, I'll put one of these down too quick. Modern medicine submits and subordinates this philosophy of healing and caring. It still has it, but it subordinates it to something, and that is autonomy and choice. Now, you might initially think, well, that's benign, isn't it? It can be. So, for example, don't force a treatment or medication on somebody except in extremis, but you should be extremely reluctant. But let's say the patient wants to do something that harms either themselves or someone else. So what happens then? Because this is a complete violation of first do no harm medicine. All right, because remember, this kind of pro-choice medicine, if I can put it that way, it just doesn't violate Christian ethics, it violates Hippocratic medicine as well. So when I say that if Christianity hadn't existed, what kind of healthcare would we have? We might still have Hippocratic medicine, first do no harm, but I'm saying you wouldn't necessarily have the philosophy extend healthcare to everyone equally if you can. But what pro-choice medicine, it doesn't only subordinate and attack the Christian basis of healthcare, it also attacks Hippocratic medicine. A point that I also made in a debate once with Peter Boyden, who was saying, well, you can have your own hospitals so long as you can privately fund them. And I said, the question still remains, should public hospitals be allowed to sometimes kill patients? So, examples of the violation of first do no harm medicine, one is obviously abortion. Another one is assisted suicide or euthanasia, okay, directly attack the patient. So if somebody comes in and says, I want an abortion, well, it's obviously a violation of first do no harm medicine, isn't it? And if they say, I want assisted suicide or euthanasia, well, that's a massive violation as well, isn't it? And properly speaking, are either of them medicine? And the answer is obviously no. Or what about, here's an even more controversial one, gender reassignment surgery. So somebody comes in and they want to change sex, and they want a healthy organ removed for no medical necessity. Is that medicine? Doesn't that violate first do no harm medicine? And I would suggest it certainly does. So as I say, none of these things are, strictly speaking, medicine at all. Which is a pretty important point. Now, abortion, obviously a massive violation of Christian healthcare and also Hippocratic medicine. So, I was saying earlier, one of the accusations is that Catholic healthcare is opposed to women's health. Even though we had a sister charity founding the first hospital for women in Ireland, how's that against women's health? It's just absurd. But before we repealed the 8th Amendment, we had one of the lowest maternal mortality rates in the world. All right, so if being opposed to abortion was against women's health, then why did we have one of the lowest maternal death rates in the world? All right, so clearly we were doing a great job. We were caring for both patients extremely well, something to be incredibly proud of. Now we have maternity hospitals. In one place, they're doing their absolute best to save mother and child, and another place, they're conducting an abortion, which has no basis in health whatsoever. The mother is perfectly healthy, and the baby is perfectly healthy, and they abort the baby. That has nothing to do with healthcare. It is a violation of healthcare. So the idea that we have somehow got to hang our heads in shame compared with what we call modern medicine is nonsense. And by the way, all the advancements in modern medicine, so it's obviously improving in techniques, treatments, drugs, all of this, that would have all happened anyway. But if we retained a Christian, Catholic, or even Hippocratic ethos, we would not be deliberately killing patients. So last year, apparently, we had 8,500 abortions. There's about 55,000 births. And as I say, almost none of these could be remotely justified on anything that would be considered a genuine health ground. And the proposal now is to make the law even more radical than it already is. So we have this abortion law review that came out recently. And what it wants to do is completely decriminalise abortion. So that means you could perform an abortion for any reason at any point in the pregnancy and you would face no penalty. In Britain, by the way, a woman has just gone to prison for about 14 months. She aborted her baby when the baby was 8 months along with the pregnancy. Now, you can take a view that you don't have to apply the law in practice in cases like that you've got to show some mercy, although whether the doctor should be a person who sold her the abortion drugs, that's a different question. But to lift even in principle and in theory the idea that there is no penalty for killing an unborn baby when it's extremely well along in the pregnancy, that's highly problematic. But anyway, The Abortion Law Review has proposed to completely decriminalise abortion. It also wants to get rid of the 3-day waiting period. Now, by the way, 3-day waiting periods are not completely uncommon. They exist in a number of European countries, and the idea is this is not an insignificant choice you're making. It's not a decision to have an appendix removed or something, okay? It's a very morally significant thing you're about to do because it is going to end a life. So it seems kind of appropriate that maybe should be a moment of pause while you consider whether this is what you want to do. But this is considered insulting to women by those who advocate further liberalisation of the law, and so they want to get rid of the 3-day waiting period. But there is evidence, in fact, that the 3-day waiting period does save lives. So you have a baby who is saved as a result, and a mother who doesn't live to regret the abortion. So I call that win-win, and yet they want to get rid of this 3-day waiting period. You remember in the abortion debate that there was an awful lot of talk about so-called fatal fetal abnormality. And so the law that was brought in says that if a baby is likely to die within 28 days of birth, it can be aborted until way later than 12 weeks, I think up to 24 weeks maybe. So this isn't good enough for the Abortion Law Review because it knows some babies live past 28 days with a condition that will eventually kill it. But it could take a couple of years or more to eventually kill the child. So they want the 28 days lifted and doctors to be able to exercise their judgment as to whether this will be an eventually fatal abnormality. But that's not good enough because they also want to allow abortion in the case of non-fatal abnormalities. Because if a person is told, a couple are told your baby has something like Down syndrome, you're supposed to go to England to have the abortion. Britain does allow that, and the view here now is, at least from the Abortion Law Review, they should be allowed to have the abortion here. They're also very critical, really, of conscience rights, so the conscience rights of pro-life doctors and nurses. So they recommend that when a hospital, a maternity unit or hospital is employing someone, that it positively discriminates in favour of doctors and nurses willing to perform abortions. It also recommends something that apparently the HSE is already doing, which is called values clarification. So they sit you down when you're first joining a maternity unit or hospital, you could be a nurse or doctor, and they will clarify your values for you, which means they will push you in a pro-choice direction. So eventually they want there to be no pro-life doctors and nurses working in Irish maternity units and hospitals. This is the ideal. And I can only imagine what medical schools are teaching right now, because I doubt very much that they're teaching doctors and nurses to be pro-life. They are teaching them to be pro-choice. So over time, this is going to have a really bad effect, because you're going to have an area of medicine in which people with a pro-life ethos don't exist anymore. They're also proposing to divert funding away from hospitals and maternity units that refuse to perform abortions. Because I think there's 19 maternity hospitals and units in the country, and I think about 9 of them still don't perform abortions because there's so many pro-life doctors and nurses in them. Now we have before the Dáil a People Before Profit bill that proposes to adopt all of these incredible recommendations of the Abortion Law Review, and a majority of TDs voted in favour of it. Now it hasn't been passed, it's got to the second stage. The government is kind of hemming and hawing a little bit, but I've no doubt that eventually this government or the next one will push on. So those of us who warned, this is only the first step, we're completely right. How are we doing for time? Okay. Just a quick word. Eugenics. So what's eugenics? Eugenics is eliminating those considered unfit for life. So in the past, eugenics was imposed. So if you go not just to Germany, not just to Nazi Germany, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, parts of America, they forcibly sterilized women and men who were considered unfit to breed. All right, you're going to pass on a genetic abnormality. So we're going to compulsorily sterilize you. So for example, in Denmark, between the 1930s and 70s, under a continual social democratic government, they forcibly sterilized about 60,000 women. Many of them single mothers, take note. So the idea, rip the Catholic Church out of our history, everything would have been fine, let's be more like those Swedes. Well, look what was happening. And they made some of those women have abortions, and some of them were consigned to their equivalent of mother and baby homes too. So now it's not compulsory. What we're doing instead is pregnancy screening. We're just getting earlier and earlier in the pregnancy. It's non-invasive, so it doesn't have to be the old amniocentesis and the needle into the womb. And they can identify with increasing accuracy and sophistication whether your baby has something like Down syndrome. And the former master of the Rotunda Hospital, Fergal Malone, recently admitted that 95% of couples who are told their baby has Down syndrome will abort them. So they go to England. That is eugenics, okay? And as these early pregnancy testing becomes more widespread, it's fully paid for in places like Denmark and I think Netherlands, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And we will do this in the name of compassion, and we will pat ourselves on the back for how modern and progressive we are, and we will continue to condemn old Ireland. The Iona Institute recently got out a paper about eugenics, but needless to say was completely ignored by the media, contacted radio programs to see if they were interested, and of course they were not. I could say a few words about euthanasia. I'm just going to say, because we're already up to about 40 minutes. So euthanasia, assisted suicide, is currently before an Oireachtas committee. The first public meeting was yesterday, so they are considering whether to allow euthanasia and assisted suicide for the terminally ill. And I have little doubt it is what they will do, all right? And that will only be the start of it, because nearly every other country that has introduced this for the terminally ill then extended to the very seriously ill, physically ill, and Canada is just getting around, it'll do it I think by March of next year, to extending it to the mentally ill. All right, so they're extending and extending and extending the grounds. There have been calls in Canada by a number of academics to extend euthanasia to the poor because they might find their lives too miserable to go on living. So this is, imagine, I mean, there couldn't be anything more antithetical to Christian healthcare and Hippocratic medicine than that. And you see, the whole philosophy is, if your suffering is considered unbearable, then you ought to have a right to end your life. And it's best to get a doctor because they'll be able to do it successfully. All right, so this is obviously an extremely dark development. In Netherlands, when they introduced it in about 2002, I think in the first year there was about 1,600 deaths by euthanasia or assisted suicide. The latest figure I could find was 2016, and it had risen to over 6,000. Canada 2 years ago, the number of deaths in this way was 10,000, and the latest figures for a year ago seems to be about 13,500. It is expanding and expanding and expanding. And our population is rapidly aging, all right? And so that's going to become extremely expensive. Pension system, healthcare system. So isn't that kind of a problem looking at solutions so-called in the face, right? And we consider ourselves compassionate when we do it, if we do it. The best hope of resisting this are the palliative care doctors, in my opinion. So these are the doctors who should be most in favour of euthanasia because they deal with end of life all the time and they deal with cancer sufferers every day, but they know perfectly well that euthanasia and assisted suicide will put these patients under pressure who are in a very vulnerable situation. So rising to the challenge, well, we must robustly defend conscience rights. Because if we do not robustly defend conscience rights, then we will wake up one day and there will be no pro-life doctors and nurses in our hospitals. They will be hounded out. And that will not be of consequence only in the maternity units. It will also be of consequence in things like the oncology units. So anybody reaching the end of their life. So do we want hospitals or even hospices in which there is nobody committed to first do no harm medicine? What a complete and utter moral disaster that would be if it happened. So we have to defend conscience rights. And that, by the way, means we've got to come up with something that is an alternative to what the medical schools are now putting out and pouring out, okay? So, I mean, somebody somewhere needs to find training that is pro-life, okay, and is dedicated not just to Christian healthcare but to Hippocratic medicine as well, or we're going to have no such doctors left. The remaining hospitals, obviously, the remaining Catholic hospitals, have to robustly defend their ethos. They can't just simply go with the flow, as in my opinion St. Vincent's Hospital has just done. So St. Vincent's Hospital getting rid of all the religious symbols. I mean, St. Vincent's Hospital said a few years ago, this is when the Civita Halapanavor abortion law was passed, we will perform anything that's lawful in the state. And I'm thinking, anything? Really? Because that will eventually be euthanasia, never mind abortion. So you're willing to perform anything that's legal and allowed in the state. So actually, even Senator Roland Mullen was pointing this out on radio last week, maybe it's a good thing all the religious symbols are gone. Because would you really want a statue of the Virgin Mary in a place conducting abortion and euthanasia? I'm not so sure that you would. And hospitals, like the Mater, I think is still holding the line quite well. But it's going to be so necessary for these hospitals to find good people for the boards, for the trustees and so on. So not just the doctors. You're going to have somebody who's really willing to defend properly the ethos and is willing to turn up to posh dinner parties, okay, and put up with people saying, I can't believe your hospital doesn't perform these things yet. It's so barbaric and so primitive and so old-fashioned that you won't perform euthanasia. So it needs people with the moral gumption to go to these posh dinner parties and say, we're not doing it. All right? Private hospitals are going to become extremely important because if you're in receipt of public funds, you can be pressured an awful lot more. So the hospitals founded by Jimmy and Rosemary, all right, so the Black Rock Clinic, Galway, and the Hermitage are going to be incredibly important because it'll be much harder to put them under pressure because they won't be receiving public funds. So they could potentially, in a number of years' time, become the last hospitals in Ireland that are really performing medicine as it is properly understood. That is never deliberately harming anyone, never mind ending a life. But it'll be really important that these hospitals, long after we're all dead and gone, continue to have good boards of management who are fully committed to the ethos of those hospitals. I was thinking, actually, I wonder, would there be anything to be said for endowing an annual lecture in some of these hospitals that considers some of these issues and getting some of the doctors to come along and maybe listen to them. So those hospitals are going to become beacons, performing medicine as it ought to be practiced. We need to become better informed about our own record, as I've been trying to do here, because we have done our absolute best to provide health care to everybody for the last 2,000 years. Today, Catholic organizations worldwide are running 5,000 hospitals and 16,000 health clinics, helping millions of people every year, and these are mainly in developing countries. And previously, a lot of these countries would have had none of this, and we're supposed to be somehow ashamed of that kind of a system. I saw a little clip, would you believe it, on RTE recently. There was a Holy Rosary sister who had reached the age of 90, and this particular nun, along with some of the other Irish Holy Rosary sisters, had taught in Cameroon for a good number of years. And some of their students had reached middle age, and they came back to celebrate this nun's birthday. And so RTE sent out the cameras to the airport because the nuns went out to meet them. So these women have gone on to become doctors and engineers and what have you, very successful in their careers. And the gratitude towards the nuns they displayed was the best ad for nuns that I've ever seen. So let's see a movie about that, eh? Instead of putting the Magdalene sisters on constant loop. So millions and millions of people helped by these. So this is something to be proud of near the end. I know it's warm in here. So what we've got is a new ethos that's enveloping healthcare that justifies killing patients in certain circumstances. And as I say, that's not medicine at all. So this is a dark development. And it is why Catholic and Christian healthcare have actually never been more badly needed. And the torch must be kept lit until eventually we return there's something like common sense. So we need to hold our nerve. We need to get educated. We need to become prouder of what we've done, better at defending what we've done, hold on to what we've got, maintain it. It's a fantastic heritage. Thank you.